So in this video, I'm going to talk you through a lesson plan for teaching students how to assess researched sources. Now, this is a particularly important lesson plan in the world of misinformation and fake news and things like this. And that is something that I emphasize to my students, is that with so much often purposefully misleading information out there nowadays, it's incredibly important to be able to determine how reliable and trustworthy a particular piece of information or a particular source is. So I start this lesson out by asking my students to do an opening free write, which is what's the most important thing that you consider when determining if a piece of information is trustworthy and why? So what's the main thing that they consider when determining whether to believe a piece of information and why? Then we have a few students give us their answers. And then I teach my students the CARB method. Now, I've done a video about that before, about assessing researched sources, and I talk in more detail about the CARB method there, but basically, you're looking at currency, authority, reliability, and bias. So what I do is, up on the board, I put C, A, R, B. And so we've got it all spread out. There's space to elaborate about each one of them. And then because I have my students actually watch my own video about assessing research sources for homework the night before, I ask them to refresh our memories about what each of these letters stands for. So what does the C stand for? And then when they say currency, I put it up on the board. What does the A stand for? Authority, put it up on the board, etc., etc. Then I go through each of these criteria. First, we define it. So what is currency? What is reliability? What is bias, etc., etc. Then we talk about how you assess it. So, why does currency matter? How do we determine whether or not something is current? How do we determine whether or not a piece of information is reliable? What types of bias might we run into? These sorts of things. So we get some information about them up on the board. Then once we've talked through these different standards for assessing sources, I ask them to look at some essays that they read for homework recently. So this semester, I had them look at Terence Monmani. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. I apologize if I'm not. His essay, How Much Do Americans Know About Science? And Marguerite Del Giudice's Why It's Crucial to Get More Women into Science. These are readings out of the 3rd edition of the new Harb Race Guide, which I'm not going to be using in the spring, in the next semester from the time of filming. So I'm going to be using different essays. I encourage you to use whatever essays appeal to you. But I've given them 2 essays that they're going to be looking at. And what I ask them to do is rate each of these essays for each of the categories: high, medium, or low. So does this essay have a high degree of currency? Is it very current? Is it reliable? Does it have a medium degree of currency, or does it have a low degree of currency? The trick with this one is when you get to bias, you kind of have to reverse your thinking, because having a high degree of currency, a high degree of authority, a high degree of reliability is all good. Having a high degree of bias is bad. So I actually ask them to think about it in the opposite direction, where if bias is not a problem in this essay, they'll rate it high. If bias is a significant problem, they'll rate it low. I think it's still a little bit confusing often for students, but that's okay. We get the gist of it. So that's essentially what I did this semester. I'm going to give you a bonus portion of this lesson plan because actually in previous semesters, I've often done a different activity, but I couldn't find a copy of the sheet that I usually use. So I did this version instead. But if you don't want to do it that way, if you don't want to pull up a couple of essays or things like that that they've read for homework, another approach that you can take for an activity to teach assessing research sources is to present them with a list of sources that students need to rank from most to least reliable. Typically, so what I've done in the past is I've actually had a sheet from the Penn State libraries where they listed 10 sources about broadly speaking, about fraternities and Greek culture on university campuses. Um, I, I, I think there was a variety of topics about Greek life within the list that they had, but that's the general list. So they had 10 things, and they gave you the full citation for it. So you got proper information. You got the author, you got the title, you got the publisher, journal, magazine, newspaper title, if it was an article, whatever it is. And you ask students to rank them 1 through 10. I'm actually, I think, going to create my own updated version of this sheet, and I'm probably only going to put maybe 5 or 6 because it's a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. The 10 is fine, but the activity ends up stretching a little bit if you have them do 10. But typically what I do when I teach this activity is I'll put a chart up on the board. So on one axis, it's the name of the source. And on the other axis, it's 1 through 10. And basically for what we do after I give them the time to rank these sources, and I let them work by themselves with a partner or small group, whatever they prefer. Once they've had time to rank these different sources, we take a vote, essentially. And so I'll say, for this first source, how many of you rated that 1, the most reliable? How many of you rated it 2? How many of you rated it 3, et cetera, et cetera? And we keep score. So we see where people rated different sources. And that gives us a good sense of how different people are thinking about different components of it. So like